March, in the Pacific Northwest, you might be lucky to find this enchanting member of the Araceae plant family, the Chiquiton americanus, Lysichiton americanus, western skunk cabbage, yellow skunk cabbage, or swamp lantern. Cousins, eastern skunk cabbage, Symplocarpus fetidus, in eastern North America. On the other side of the Bering Strait, there is the beautiful Lysichiton kamchakensis, Asian skunk cabbage, white skunk cabbage, far eastern swamp lantern, or Japanese swamp lantern. The name skunk cabbage refers to the odor that its blooms release. The odor attracts pollinators, scavenging flies and beetles, the very few pollinators that are already active very early in the season when species of this genus, Lysichiton, are in bloom. Comparative to other members of the Araceae plant family, this species is not all that skunky. Probably their very bright yellow blooms can attract the early pollinators seeking blooms early in season without the strong smell other members of the family produce. Araceae plant family species have a characteristic type of inflorescence with small, densely packed flowers in a spadix, a spike-like inflorescence, usually enveloped in a large spathe on a long stalk. One of the first blooms in late winter or early spring, this species adapted to attract pollinators with these lantern-like spathe and odor, a food promise. After pollination and fertilization, the very attractive yellow spathe will fall off, and the name of the genus, Lysichiton, translates from Greek in losing its cloak. While the bright yellow spathe attracts pollinators to the small flowers on the spadix, losing the spathe will make the developing fruits less conspicuous. Their very large leaves will remain an intriguing feature. Their leaves are some of the largest simple undivided leaves of plants native to this region, collecting energy to be stored in their large rhizomes to be used for next year's bright blooms early in the season. Native to the Pacific Northwest, extending south to Northern California and east to Idaho and Montana, because it's such an unusual and attractive perennial that grows easily on marshy areas, it was introduced in the UK early 20th century. It escaped cultivation and naturalized in marshy areas of Britain and Ireland, and it is now classified as an invasive species by the European Union. Like many members of the Araceae plant family, it contains calcium oxalate crystals that cause prickling sensation to tongue and throat when ingested, followed by intestinal irritation and worse. Still, deer and other herbivores may occasionally browse their leaves, while American black bears will eat its rhizomes as a laxative after emerging from hibernation. Local people used its leaves and large rhizomes as food in time of scarcity after neutralizing the calcium oxalate by roasting or boiling. An even more common use of its large waxy leaves was to line berry baskets or wrap around salmon or other food when baked. The leaves also served as medicated bandage to address sores, swelling, and other skin conditions. I still remember the first time I met this species, March 2000, in a very green Hoh rainforest, the Hall of Mosses. An amazing apparition that I did not expect in the northern side of the temperate climate. A great plant to encourage on your own marshy area if you live in the regions where it is native to. Besides beautiful blooms and leaves, its roots and rhizomes help prevent soil erosion. And together with other native plants, it will contribute to a healthy planet for a healthy humanity. Western skunk cabbage, yellow skunk cabbage, swamp lantern, Lysichiton americanus. Mid-April, here at the Pacific Rim Institute, together with Oregon grape, Mahonia aquifolium, plant family Berberidaceae or Berberidaceae, cousins Berberis vulgaris or barberry, an Eurasian species, and Berber's twin Burgii, also known as Japanese barberry, cultivated as a short ornamental throughout North America. Here in the Pacific Northwest, Mahonia nervosa, also known as short Oregon grape or dull Oregon grape. Terrible names. I would be nervous too. But this, it's tall Oregon grape, or shiny-leaved Oregon grape, or wholly-leaved Oregon grape. The name aquifolium refers to the fact that its leaves are shiny and they look like they've been just watered. Another connection is to Aquifoliaceae. This is the family for holly, genus Ilex, and this happens to be Ilex aquifolium, also known as English holly. It was introduced here as an ornamental and is doing pretty good for itself, naturalizing, which is why here on the Pacific Rim Institute, we actually are removing it. And I'm strongly advising that you should do the same on your property if it's not in its native range. And it's not in its native range here in the Pacific Northwest of North America. They're shiny, waxy, and survive winter without losing a lot of water. So Mahonia aquifolium, tall or wholly leaved Oregon grape, because they have relatively similar leaves, at least in shape of the leaflet versus the entire leaf. They have these very spinulose margins and very shiny appearance. Aquifoliaceae, Ilex aquifolium and Mahonia aquifolium. The big difference comes into the fact that this is a simple leaf. Well, this is a compound leaf. And in this particular species, it has usually 5 to 9 leaflets. The leaflets are oppositely arranged and they have no petiolule. And you know this is a leaflet and this is a whole leaf because this leaf in holly has a bud subtended by this leaf. Holly has alternate simple leaves, where Oregon grape has opposite leaflets. Here we have a compound leaf, pinnately compound leaf, with oppositely arranged leaflets. And this particular type is also called oddly pinnately compound because it has a single terminal leaflet. Oregon grape, incidentally the state flower of Oregon State, has a much larger native range, going north to southern British Columbia and south to northern California. In Washington, it grows on both sides of the Cascades, extending farther east to northern Idaho and eastern Montana. An evergreen shrub that grows 1 to 2 meters tall, occasionally taller, especially in the forest. It can tolerate full sun as well as partial shade. It blooms from March till June, depending on what latitude or altitude you're located. And even though it produces a high amount of flower, fruits, and seeds for sexual reproduction, it's also easily stoloniferous, reproducing through vegetative reproduction. And this way, it can become invasive even in its native range. But it is deer resistant, which is important, especially right here on Whidbey Island. It provides habitat for biodiversity, as well as feed for a variety of pollinators early in spring. It blooms bright yellow, which can lighten up an occasionally gloomy spring day. Its blooms are clustered in a dense raceme, and they have multiple rows of perianth, start as pinkish crimson buds, and then when fully open are fragrant and yellow, attracting a variety of pollinators. So even though it's called Oregon grape, it's not a member of the Vitaceae or the grape plant family, but it produces fruit that could remind you of grapes. They range from blue to darker with a plume. They're very seedy and quite sour, but delicious if you like sour. They're consumed by coastal pre-Columbian populations, making a great addition to otherwise fatty salmon or venison. Being stoloniferous, it can become invasive even if it's native range. But you can mow it, and you can dig it, or you can invite an herbalist friend that might want to use the roots, which were used for a variety of medicinal applications. Unfortunately, there is not enough scientific support. Cautions: Oregon grape fruits and herbal preparations can lower blood pressure and blood sugar levels, a problem for people that are already on medications for high blood pressure or high blood sugar levels. Also very important to note, preparations of Oregon grape are very dangerous to infants and pregnant women. They contain berberine, which can affect brain development. Totally safe for an adult. Nobody's gonna eat too many. They're small, not as easy to pick. And did I mention sour? But if you have any land in its native range, you might consider Oregon grape, tall Oregon grape, holly-leaved Oregon grape, Mahonia aquifolium, also known as Berberis aquifolium, as an ornamental evergreen shrub. Which can lighten up an occasionally gloomy spring day. Mid-April, here on Pacific Rim Institute Prairie Remnant, together with shooting star, broadleaf shooting star, or Henderson shooting star, Primula hendersonii. Family, Primulaceae, from first, as they bloom very early in spring, and Hendersonii in honor of plant collector Louis Henderson. He recognized it as very similar to Primula media on the eastern side of North America, and he sent a sample to Asa Gray, Harvard botany professor and the most important American botanist of the 19th century, also close correspondent of Charles Darwin. Cousins, other primulas, of course Primula media that looks very similar on eastern North America, but also primulas in Eurasia, such as Primula viris, Primula elatior, and even cyclamens, with whom they share these unusual bent back type petals. Primula hendersonii and other shooting stars are spring ephemerals. They bloom early and they take advantage of the few pollinators early in spring, and then they become dormant throughout the drier summer months. Leaves are all arranged in a rosette, very tight to the ground, and they are ovate to elliptical, and slightly not fleshy, but relatively thick. The scape, or the leafless flowering stem, ends in an umbel with 2 to several flowers. The flowers usually have 5 sepals and 5 petals, but they can vary. The flowers have these very unusual reflexed petals, which expose the stamens, which are very tightly arranged around the pistil, and then the stigmites protruding very slightly. The base of the petals, it's also a different color. So the petals are usually magenta or pink and occasionally white, while the base around the anthers, in fact around the stamens, it's yellowish white, which it's more attracting to its pollinators. The reflex petals and the lack of nectar offer, like other primulas do, it's a direct correlation with their buzz pollination. They do not offer nectar, but they offer more pollen, which is very important to the pollinators that can do this type of sonication, high-frequency buzzing or buzz pollination, to release the pollen from their very tight stamens. And those are bumblebees and other bees. The flowers are pendant or pendulous, while the petals are bent back. After pollination, fertilization occurs inside of the ovary and the ovules, and eventually the petals drop out and the whole flower straightens up, shooting for the stars. The ovary develops into a capsule, eventually opens up when the seeds inside are mature, and it just rattles in the wind, spreading a few seeds today and maybe a few more seeds tomorrow when it might be windier. Primula, it's a new genus for this particular group with bent back sepals. Till recently, they were called dodecathion, which simply means 12 gods in Greek, referring to their beauty, like flowers of the gods. And also relatively similar to cyclamens, which are on Mount Olympus and the 12 gods of the Greek mythology. This particular species of primula or shooting star, Primula hendersonii, it's native to western Washington and Oregon, and it goes north to southwestern British Columbia and south to northern California. Primula hendersonii can be found in prairies like this one. It also does well in open forest and forest edge. If you have any land in these locations where this particular primula is native to, and you want to add more color to your spring, this is a species you can encourage and nurture. Mid-April, here at the Pacific Rim Institute, together with Erythronium oreganum, fawn lily, giant fawn lily, deer's tongue. Erythronium oreganum native range goes from southern British Columbia to northern California. Here in Washington, it's native to the western side of the Cascades, but extending east on Columbia River Gorge. Lilies have tepals, 3 sepals and 3 petals that look very much alike. They also have 6 stamens that surround the 3 divided stigma and ovary. When the flowers are fully mature, they're usually pendant with reflexed tepals to expose the stamens and the stigma for pollinators. After the flower is pollinated and fertilized, it will produce a capsule that is erect, upright, with numerous seeds that spread when rattled by the wind. You could collect some of these seeds and start your own patch of Erythronium oreganum. As they are so beautiful, Erythronium species are cultivated as ornamentals and easily hybridize. And they are relatively easy propagated from seed that you can pick later in summer, which can take a while. Some species also propagate through vegetative reproduction. They're spring ephemerals and then survive the rest of the summer, fall, and winter as an underground storage stem, in this case, a corm. Lilies have an underground storage stem called a corm. They're deep-seated and they are full of starch. The corm, it's apparently edible, and pre-Columbian populations were eating them cooked or dried and occasionally ground into a flour, as they are full of starch. What makes this particular Erythronium different than other species here in the Pacific Northwest, it's first the blotches on their leaves that are white and maroon, and grows at lower elevations comparative to Erythronium montanum, which is the only other white Erythronium here in the Pacific Northwest, which grows, as the name says, at higher elevations. The name Erythronium comes from erythros, from Greek for red, and it refers to the only native species to Europe, which extends from Portugal to Ukraine, and its name is Erythronium dense canis. And it has pink purplish tepals. I was gonna call them petals. Dense canis means dog's tooth. I don't know why. Species of Erythronium are found in both western and eastern North America. In the eastern North America, you might find Erythronium albidum or Erythronium americanum. The genus Erythronium can be found all around north temperate forests, meadows, and prairies, including Japan, Erythronium japonicum. If you have any piece of land, forest edge, or prairie, in the area that this Erythronium is native to, you might want to encourage one more native plant to cheer up your spring. April, here in the Pacific Northwest, together with fairy sleeper orchid, Calypso bulbosa, family Orchidaceae or Orchidaceae. Cousins are the orchids, of course. Its cousins, lady sleeper Cypripedium, so much larger flowers. In this case, the labellum is about 1 centimeter wide. Fairy sleeper orchid, Calypso bulbosa, has one corm that looks more like a bulb, hence the specific epithet bulbosa, emerging from a very, very tiny seed, just like all orchids. And then, after several years of growth, eventually in late fall and early winter, one leaf appears, which survives winter, gathering energy for the upcoming flower. The leaf is broadly ovate and pleated with a very short petiole sitting tight on the ground. The flower has the characteristic symmetry of orchids with bilateral symmetry that can be divided in 2 equal halves only through one plane, hence the name bilateral or zygomorphic. The perianth ranges in color from magenta to pink to occasionally white, turning beige as they mature. They have 3 sepals and 2 petals that look alike, originally pendant and then upright. The lower petal is modified, the labellum, and it is saccate, like a sac, or shoe-shaped, and it has additional white and brown markings, maybe looking a little bit like a pollinator, and maybe that's one way to attract other pollinators. The stamens and pistil are fused together at the top of this lower petal, the labellum, making it easier for pollinators. After pollination and fertilization, it produces one cylindrical capsule with a top opening that, when the seeds are ripe, it rattles in the wind, spreading some seeds today and maybe more seeds tomorrow when the wind is stronger, or maybe going in another direction, or maybe going farther away. Calypso bulbosa grows from low elevation to mid elevation to even high elevation, and it prefers moist, coniferous, or mixed forests with filtered light and rich humus soil. Here in the Pacific Northwest, it tolerates dry summers. Calypso bulbosa variety occidentalis, native range, extends from Alaska to northern California, on both sides of the Cascade Mountains, going east to the Rocky Mountains. In the northeastern North America, you might be lucky to find Calypso bulbosa variety americana. From Scandinavia through Russia, China, Mongolia, and Japan, you will find Calypso bulbosa variety bulbosa. At high altitudes of China, Korea, and Japan, you would find Calypso bulbosa variety speciosa, as in beautiful or special. Calypso bulbosa is not only a short plant, it's also a short-lived perennial with only about 5 years of lifespan. Temperate climate orchids are very fragile and they don't transplant well. If you try to move them because you really love them or for personal gain, you can endanger the species. But if you're fortunate enough to own a piece of land in the native range of these fairy slippers, it would be wonderful if you can protect them so fairy slipper can enchant future generations. Late April, here at the Pacific Rim Institute, together with camas. Common camas, blue camas, little camas, Camasia quamash. Family, Asparagaceae. Cousins, Camasia coeloides on the eastern side of North America, which has smaller, more numerous, and lighter blue or very light blue, sky blue flowers. Blue camas is native to western North America, extending from British Columbia and Alberta to Washington, Idaho, Montana, and Utah, and south to California. It inhabits grasslands such as prairies and meadows, as well as forest edge and along rivers, from sea level to mid-elevations. Camas comes from a pre-Columbian First Nation language meaning sweet, referring to their bulb, similar to a sweet onion, but only about a centimeter wide. Camasia quamash, camas, is a spring ephemeral, surviving winter as an underground bulb. In spring, the plant sends out first leaves, numerous basal leaves, that are relatively thin, few millimeters, and usually shorter than the flowering scape. The scape, it's a flowering stem that has no leaves, so a leafless flowering stem. And it's a raceme producing numerous flowers that can range from light blue to purple blue to deep purple, and occasionally even white. It has 6 sepals, which are petals and sepals that look alike, even though they're pretty clear in 2 whorls. Their stamens, also 6, have anthers that start yellow and then they turn blue or purple. The pistil has a 3-divided stigma, very fragile and thin, and here at the base, the ovary is also a 3-chambered ovary. After the pollination and fertilization, the tepals will fall off, the stamens will fall off, and the ovary will start developing into a fruit, which is an ovoid capsule with numerous dark black seeds. Besides this edible camas, its bulbs, in the same plains, meadows, and prairies, there is another camas, which is called deadly camas. And it's in a different family and a different genus, but the bulbs look quite similar. So the best way to enjoy the bulbs and not suffer the consequences is to actually pick them when you know for sure you're dealing with this edible camas, the blue camas. Nowadays, pre-Columbian populations, First Nations people, are picking the bulbs in spring instead of what in the past used to be a fall endeavor. Dev camas is toxicoscordion, which literally translates in toxic garlic from Greek scordion, venenosum. I mean, that kind of tells you it's not a good idea to mess up with that plant, right? And it's in a family that's notorious for its venomous, which are not venomous. Plants are poisonous, animals are venomous. So that also includes trilliums, and an European trillium has actually 4 leaves and petals and everything, and that's called Paris, and is known as being poisonous. But also veratrum, or Indian hellebore, which is also known for being poisonous. And here in the Northwest, in a Veratrum viride, it's the plant that I'm talking about. So poisonous camas, it's in the Melanthanaceae. But this is Asparagaceae. Its name camas comes from a pre-Columbian language. And this particular plant was a very important plant, and it's, again, a very important plant to cultures of pre-Columbian people. So coastal populations did not have a grain, but this is one of the plants that supplemented that need. So what they used to do, they would come in spring, they would get rid of the poisonous camas, and then they would tender to those pastures, including with occasional fire and weeding and so on, so they can come back in the fall and dig the bulbs, now knowing that they are just the edible camas. The bulbs are pit roasted, boiled, dried, and pounded into flour. They're very sweet and good tasting, but one of the sugars it contains is inulin, which does not cause a sugar spike, but it can cause flatulence and even indigestion. If you have any prairie in the native range of this plant, you could try to encourage it to catch a bulb halt on your land. Besides a delicious bulb, blue camas is an ornamental plant, not for cut flowers, but for creating a native plant habitat. Instead of introducing bluebells or hyacinths from across the ocean, you might explore how can you create your own native plant habitat. Encouraging more native plants on your land can bring back the very intricate relationships between plants and pollinators and other members of a healthy ecosystem, creating a healthier planet for a healthy humanity. Together with a very busy bee, late April, here at the Pacific Rim Institute, together with spring gold, or biscuit root, or bladder desert parsley. And it is related to parsley in the same family of Apiaceae or Umbelliferae, or Apiaceae or Umbelliferae. And they're called Umbelliferae because they carry umbels. Umbels are this particular type of inflorescence when from one particular point you have an array of several pedicels on this peduncle, the stem, the stalk of the inflorescence. In this case, it has very few bracts at the base comparative to, for example, Queen's Anne's lace, which is also wild carrot, which has much more involved bracts underneath this umbel. Also on this particular species of Lomatium utriculatum or Lomatium utriculatum, depending who you ask, the pedicels, the rays of this umbel are not equal in size. The leaves are basal. The reason it's called bladder desert parsley, it's, first of all, the leaves look more like dill to me, but not that far away from parsley as well, which are obviously related and in the same family of Apiaceae or Umbelliferae. But the bladders are referring to these clasping basal part of the leaf. So this is a leaf which is multiply divided to these very thin divisions. It's apparently edible, just like dill and parsley. And then its base, it's clasping on the stem with this bladder, which actually it's a part that was protecting the leaf before it opened up completely. It does get rather dry in this area. It is wet now because it's still spring, but it could get dry later in the season. Spring gold, the common name, refers to this abundance of bright yellow flowers cheering up a whole valley or pasture meadow, in this case, prairie remnant. Another common name besides bladder desert parsley and spring gold, referring to these gorgeously golden yellow flowers, it's also called biscuit root. The roots are edible, and hence the name biscuit root. And I'm not sure if it's the southern US biscuits or the British biscuits, as in cookies. It is rather tedious to peel it. It's delicious raw, even though I strongly recommend not eating too many. First of all, definitely not from this prairie remnant. But if you have a pasture and it's full with this biscuit roots, by all means, you might want to experiment with a handful of this biscuit roots. But it is related to the carrots, and you can make a carrot cake, so why not a biscuit root? But this family of Apiaceae also includes deadly poisonous plants such as poison hemlock, and even worse than poison hemlock, if it's, if you could believe, it's water hemlock. It is a Eurasian plant, a North African plant, but it was introduced probably inadvertently to North America. And here in the Pacific Northwest, there is also another water hemlock besides the Eurasian water hemlock, which are also deadly poisonous. So I don't like to experiment too much with plants from particularly this family, unless I'm clearly told that other people before me have tried them and they are not bad. After pollination and fertilization, it will produce seeds. The seeds are rather large and they're winged, flat, discoidal, and they're taken by the wind. And they also can be used for flavoring. Again, in my opinion, in small amounts because, they're not selected for being edible plants. But if you have any piece of land in the regions where this plant is native to, which is Western North America, from British Columbia all the way to California, in Washington on the western side of the Cascades Mountains, I encourage you to protect it and allow it to thrive. Spring gold, bladder parsley, or biscuit root, or Lomatium, Lomatium utriculatum. I encourage you to encourage it catch a root hold in your meadow or prairie or forest edge. Late April, here at the Pacific Rim Institute, together with Lomatium nudicaule or naked stem biscuit root. The root is apparently edible, and I'm not sure if it's really like a biscuit, but since it's related to the carrots, which you use in a cake, then why not? The best news is that it is edible and not deadly like other plants in this family of Apiaceae or Umbelliferae, containing also poison hemlock. Native to the western North America, both sides of the Cascades here in Washington, but extending north to British Columbia and Alberta and south to California, the leaves are basal and they're multiply divided, double alternate. So multiply divided in threes and then again in threes, but occasionally in five as well. And they're strong smelling as celery. The leaves, the entire plant, as well as their seeds. Their seeds are also used as spices, and the leaves and the roots are edible, and you can cook with them. But again, depending where you collect them, and you should collect them on your land or somewhere where they are not protected. And this will go in the herbarium, and it will make a very nice herbarium specimens with this medusa-like head. Nudicaule, its specific epithet or the adjective that defines this particular species, comes from Greek and literally means naked stem. In this case, this is actually the peduncle or the stalk of this inflorescence. The inflorescence characteristic for Apiaceae or Umbelliferae, it's an umbel, very similar to the spokes of an umbrella. And in Lomatium, it has different lengths for this particular secondary peduncles. Besides other members of this family, they have no bracts subtending the individual peduncles as well as the whole inflorescence. Like, for example, in Queen's Anslace, which is also the wild carrot. The flowers are yellowish green and relatively small, but the whole inflorescence adds a very interesting accent to a meadow or a prairie or even the side of the forest, so they can grow very well on the pathway edge next to a forest. After pollination and fertilization, the seeds will be produced on these rather large umbel inflorescence, by then being an infructescence because it will carry fruits. What we call seeds in this family of Umbelliferae or Apiaceae, they're actually fruits. but there's not a very clear fruit wall like in a peach, for example. So the fruit and the seeds are all together lumped, and they look more like a seed than a fruit. But botanically speaking, they're a fruit. If you have any piece of land in the regions native to this Lomatium nudicaule or Lomatium nudicaule or Indian celery or naked stem biscuit root, allow it a chance to catch a root hold and provide food for the native pollinators. But if you have enough, you could experiment with adding some of its leaves and even its seeds to, or maybe even some of the roots to a dish or two. Pre-Columbian populations use these plants similar to how we use other plants in this family like celery, parsley, and dill, and also for funeral ceremonies. It's a very fragrant plant, so for ceremony, the seeds were burnt and their smell would be like an incense. Also, the seeds were prepared into a tea or some other kind of concoction to soothe the throats of singers. Lomatium nudicaule. Early May, here at the Pacific Rim Institute, together with Western buttercup, Ranunculus occidentalis, family Ranunculaceae or Ranunculaceae, cousins. Other ranunculus species, of course, such as Ranunculus repens, which was introduced here in the Pacific Northwest, and it is invasive. But also other genera such as Aquilegia or Columbine and Delphinium or Delphinium. Its native range extends from Alaska to California to Alberta and Nevada. Here in Washington State, mainly on the western side of the Cascades Mountains. The name buttercup refers to the fact that their petals have nectaries that look like they've been buttered. But don't be fooled, many species of ranunculus are actually poisonous. The fruits were used by pre-Columbian populations ground in a type of flour. But the plant itself is poisonous, not necessarily deadly, but it's avoided by animals. Like most species of ranunculus, they have a really beautiful rosette of basal leaves, and then the floral stems have additional leaves a little bit different, also divided, mostly palmately divided. The pistil is apocarpous, which refers to the fact that it's a compound pistil, but the carpels are not fused to each other, developing eventually in independent achenes, a type of dry fruit with one seed inside, similar to what sunflower seeds are. So when you eat sunflowers, if they have a shell, actually you're removing the fruit ball to get to the actual seed inside. This would be a similar type fruit. The genus name Ranunculus would translate in little frog because most members of the genus at least tolerate or even thrive in a lot of water, at least their feet, hence the name little frogs. But this particular Ranunculus occidentalis tolerates dry summers. And it's mostly found in meadows and prairies and forest edge. If you have any land in the area where this particular plant is native to, I strongly encourage you at least nurture the ones you have or introduce new ones from a local nursery specialized in native plants, preferably native to the actual area you are from. Even though Ranunculus occidentalis' native range expands from Alaska to California, you should look for such a nursery closer to your home. Oh yeah, and there is a Sitka spruce and a Gary oak, obviously bonsais. Ranunculus occidentalis doesn't usually even get as high as you can see it here in a meadow or prairie, but here it was particularly nurtured. Early May, here at the Pacific Rim Institute, together with miner's lettuce, Claytonia perfoliata, family Montiaceae, or Montiaceae. Cousins: Claytonia sibirica here in the Pacific Northwest, or Siberian miner's lettuce, and farther east, Claytonia virginica, spring beauty, named in honor of John Clayton, Virginian colonist botanist. Claytonia perfoliata, it's an annual herbaceous plant that starts blooming as early as February and can go on till May, depending on altitude and latitude. And its native range is on coastal and upland western North America, from Alaska, central British Columbia, and all the way south to California, and even farther south to Central America. Its basal leaves have a more or less triangular rhomboidal shape with a very long petiole, and they form a very nice rosette. When it's ready to bloom, its upper leaves are fused, creating this appearance of Elizabethan color surrounding the raceme of several small white to pink flowers. The peduncle of the raceme, the inflorescence, could be very short or almost inexistent to several centimeters or a couple of inches long. These fused leaves subtending the inflorescence is what gives its specific epithet of perfoliata. It looks like the stem perforated or perfoliated the leaves. Miner's lettuce name comes from the fact that during the California gold rush, miners were using them in spring to prevent scurvy, as it does provide vitamin C. The whole plant is edible but the roots, and it makes an excellent trail snack. With a light vinaigrette of apple cider vinegar and some good oil, it's delicious. Even though it's not related to lettuce, which is in the Asteraceae or composite plant family, but otherwise it does have oxalates, the salts of oxalic acid, which are not good for your health, being a nephrotoxin. Luckily, you cannot eat too much of it. First, you might not be so lucky to find this abundant patch that grows so much better here in the shade. If you look at my right, it's actually much smaller in the sun. It does prefer the shady areas. If you do live in the Western North America, I strongly encourage you to forage it or even maybe plant it. It does produce numerous black seeds and they grow in dense populations. As I said, much more luscious in the shade. But I don't recommend it growing it elsewhere in North America or elsewhere. It might not be invasive, but why push it? We have other native plants in other locations. So even though I don't recommend you growing it in other places where it's not native to, if you are in the western side of the Western Hemisphere, you might want to try some of this miner's lettuce. Even though relatively bland tasting, it makes a great trail snack. Wow, what am I talking about? This is really good. Early May, here at the Pacific Rim Institute, together with Delphinium, or larkspur, Delphinium mazenzii, family Ranunculaceae, or Ranunculaceae, cousins Aquilegia ranunculus, aconitum, as well as about 300 other species of Delphinium throughout northern temperate climate, as well as mountains in tropical Africa. Delphinium and larkspur refers to the shape of the flowers with a spur, reminding some people of dolphins jumping out of waters, or reminding others of the larkspur bird. Mezenziae, honoring Scottish surgeon, botanist, naturalist who spent many years at sea and was part of the Vancouver expedition, Archibald Mezenzi. Delphinium mezenziae is native to the Pacific Northwest, from British Columbia to Oregon, and on both sides of the Cascades here in Washington state. Inhabiting coastal bluffs, meadows, and prairies, forest edge, and other grassy areas from sea level to mid-elevations in the mountains. Delphinium mezenziae is a herbaceous perennial from several gnarly black tubers. The basal leaves have long petioles, and the blades are 2 to 3 times broadly palmately divided. The stem leaves are much smaller and have shorter to no petioles. Delphinium mezenziae blooms in late spring through early summer, from April to July. Flowers are usually bright blue to purple, and they have bilateral symmetry, zygomorphic, spread out through a lax raceme. The 5 blue sepals and 4 petals together form a spur. They have numerous stamens surrounding the pistil, which is made of usually 3 not-fused carpels, forming an apocarpous gynoecium. After pollination, usually by bumblebees and butterflies, and fertilization, the carpels will transform into follicles that produce numerous black seeds. Delphinium species are toxic, poisonous to both humans and animals, and yet several species of butterfly caterpillars have figured out a way to make it their host plant. If you have any piece of land in the native range of this Delphinium mezenziae, it is yet one more native plant to add to your native plants garden. Early May, here at the Pacific Rim Institute, together with chocolate lily, checkered lily, rice root lily, Fritillaria affinis, family Liliaceae or Liliaceae, cousins Lilium, and other Fritillarias, several native here to the Pacific Northwest. In Europe, you might find Fritillaria meleagris, and there are beautiful Fritillarias throughout Middle East and Asia. Here in the Pacific Northwest, ranging from British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, all the way to California, and further east to Montana and Idaho, you can find Fritillaria affinis. Chocolate lilies inhabit grassy bolts, prairies, forest edge, from low altitude to quite high altitudes in the mountains. Chocolate lily is a perennial from a bulb that produces numerous small bulbets, which make them look like rice. And pre-Columbian First Nations were using this as food, hence the name rice root. It is a relatively small plant growing anywhere from 15 centimeters to a meter. The first leaves that are from plants that will not bloom this year are lanceolate and simple, while the blooming plant produces 2 or more whorls of 3 to 5 lanceolate leaves. The flowers are in a raceme, 3 to 5 and more, depending on the conditions, or occasionally just 1. They're pendulous with brown mottled with yellow tepals, sepals, and petals that look alike. So 6 tepals, 6 stamens, and then the stigma is split in 3 at least part way. After pollination and fertilization, a capsule of about 2 centimeters long will be formed. Capsule that it's broadly winged, very characteristic to Fritillarias. Even though it only looks like chocolate being brown mottled, it is a beautiful plant to encourage on your patch of native plants area. And you can grow it from seed or bulbs that you can buy from a nearby nursery, including Pacific Rim Institute. If you have any piece of land in the areas where this particular plant is native to, and you can encourage it to take a root hold on your prairie, it will only make the area more friendly for other native members of the ecosystem. Native plants create a habitat that allows numerous relationships between plants and animals, fungi, and more to make a healthy planet for a healthy humanity. Chocolate lily, checkered lily, rice root lily, Fritillaria affinis. Early May, here at the Pacific Rim Institute, together with golden paintbrush, Castilleja or Castilleja levisecta, family Orobanchaceae or Orobanchaceae, cousins, members of the genus Pedicularis or Rhinanthus, and of course, other members of the same genus of Castilleja or Castilleja. But this is the only golden paintbrush in its native areas of Pacific Northwest, and it was listed on the Endangered Species Act. There are only few remaining white populations, with 2 in Canada off Vancouver Island and 9 in Puget Sound, out of which most of them here on Whidbey Island and 1 known on San Juan Island. Like all Orobanchaceae, paintbrushes are at least partially parasites, and these are called hemiparasites or semiparasite. They do have green leaves and they do produce most of their own food, but they also have the ability to catch on with haustorial projections to the roots of neighboring plants, such as yarrow right here and woolly sunshine right here. So even though it can do pretty well without a host plant, it does even better with a host plant. Its more or less lanceolate leaves are sessile with no petiole clasping on the stems, and the tips of their leaves are toothed. What you see here golden, looking like petals, are actually modified leaves named bracts to take the role of petals, which are also modified leaves actually. So these yellow bracts are actually covering the flower inside, which is usually greenish or greenish yellow. And that is the characteristic for other members of this Orobanchaceae. Take, for example, Melampiro. After pollination and fertilization, they will produce a capsule and release numerous seeds. Even though they are hermaphroditic, having both male and female floral parts in each flower and numerous flowers on each plant, making the plant synoecious and the flower hermaphroditic, they're almost self-incompatible, meaning that they have other measures in place, chemical probably, that will prevent a plant from selfing, meaning they don't necessarily produce seeds. Their ovules do not get fertilized with pollen from the same plant, and not even from necessarily same population, but much better from a population hopefully nearby, so their pollinators, most probably bumblebees, can make it from a pollination to another, bringing a whole new meaning to the habitat fragmentation. Golden paintbrush grows on prairies and grasslands at low altitude, and it's an important member of the Gary oak ecosystems. There are speculations that because it's a relatively short plant growing to about 10 to 50 centimeters tall, it has adapted to the recurrent fires that probably originally were natural and then later on human-made, as pre-Columbian First Nations were trying to preserve the prairies from which they would gather food from the forests and the savannas that will encroach upon the prairies. Several factors have brought this plant species to its brink of extinctions. One of them was fire suppression. As it's relatively short, growing to only about 10 to 50 centimeters tall, it cannot easily compete with other taller plants, grasses or shrubs. Besides the fire suppression, also habitat destruction for residential and agricultural endeavors has limited the land for wild prairies to thrive. Other factors affecting native plants' ability to thrive is the encroachment of aggressive invasives such as Scotch broom and oxeye daisy, to name a couple. Pacific Rim Institute here on Whidbey Island has made great progress of bringing this species off from the brink of extinction, now taking pride in having tens of thousands of individual plants. Maintaining, creating, and allowing natural habitats to protect native species of plants will create a better community for the ecosystem to thrive that will create a healthier planet for a healthy humanity. Early May, here at the Pacific Rim Institute, together with Myanthemum racemosum, false Solomon seal, family Asparagaceae or Asparagaceae, cousins Myanthemum dilatatum, false lily of the valley, and Myanthemum stellatum, starry false Solomon seal. And they're both here on the Pacific Rim Institute and the Pacific Northwest. And throughout Europe and Asia, you might be able to find in dark shade of coniferous forests Myanthemum bifolium, a much smaller version of this mayflower. The genus name would translate from Greek as mayflower, Myanthemum. And the specific epithet for this species is racemosum, referring to either the compound raceme, a panicle, or because every branch of this terminal inflorescence is an individual raceme. The true Solomon seal doesn't have a terminal inflorescence like here. Instead, it has axillary flowers underneath each of these very similar looking leaves, hence the name false Solomon seal. Myanthemum racemosum, it's a perennial plant surviving winter as underground rhizomes that could be somewhere around 30 centimeters long, about 1 foot. In spring, they send out these long shoots that when they're very young, you can strip the leaves off and blanch them and eat them, since they will remind you a little bit of asparagus, since they are in Asparagaceae. It is a rather common plant, but 2 reasons why I would recommend against eating it. Unless you have so much and you would like to forage some in your own forest. If it's just a small patch, I would leave it alone. Also, when they're very young and you don't have the flowers, you might confuse them with other species, and in particular, species of the genus Veratrum. Here in the Pacific Northwest, Veratrum viridae, also called banberry or Indian hellebore, which is toxic or even poisonous. I can see slightly herbivory here. Probably when the shoots were younger, a deer or a rabbit found these like their own asparagus. Myanthemum racemosum, it's a relatively common plant native to the entire North America, found in almost all Canadian provinces and territories, with the exception of the Yukon and Nunavut. It is also found in all United States besides Hawaii and throughout Mexico. They usually enjoy open forests or forest edge from the sea level to middle elevations. It has somewhere around 7 to 12 alternately arranged leaves that are usually sessile or slightly clasping, or occasionally with a short petiole. The tip of the leaves, it's long and tapering. The flowers are numerous, in between 20 to 250, and they are starry shaped and having 6 tepals, petals and sepals that look alike. After pollination and fertilization, Myanthemum racemosum produces fruit sometime in summer. The fruit is spherical, 3-lobed, and it starts from being green with copper patches, and it matures as red. They're apparently edible, but not very tasty, and too many of them could be laxative. And again, I recommend against it, mostly because you can confuse it with other rather not palatable or worse species. If you have any forest in the areas where this plant is native to North America, and you're lucky enough to find this in your neck of the woods, you might as well enjoy it and protect it. Native plants create healthy habitats for the entire ecosystem, as well as you. Myanthemum racemosum, false Solomon seal. Okay guys, I hope this was it, and very important, I hope I touched the button. Did I touch the button? Yay, touch the button.